conceptually speaking, would need to be the conditions of possibility? What are conceptually speaking the conditions that would need to be satisfied in order for the occurrence of X to be? Then that's where we begin. We start to synthesize those things in order to bring about the occurrence of X. Then X exists. And why do they exist? They exist because of a product of our labor. But it's not a manual labor, it's an intellectual labor. It has not, by the time it gets manual, we've already solved the problem. All of it, categorically is, well, not categorically, because there's some nuanced points in sort of mechanics and circuits. You have to actually see it run its course. But most of the work, a lion's share of the work, is done in your head, right? Conceptually defining and conceiving of the logical relationships that allow for that possibility to manifest as actuality, right? Actually, this is absolutely not, I'm hearing myself talking, this is not necessarily intro, but you know, you'll be alright. We must understand how the apparent obstacle is to be got round, right? So the idea is, it's not just about the occurrence of X, right? We want to know about the possible, so we'll say this is a possibility. And to be specific, that is not a contradiction. C-O-N-T-R-A-D-I-C-T, right? X is a possibility, that is, it's not a contradiction, yet we don't see the occurrence. I'm not going to write the whole argument out, but A is a possibility, that is, it's not a contradiction, yet we don't observe the occurrence of X in the world, right? We don't see the alien in the world. We don't see this new technology in the world, the iPad 5. We don't see the, what have you, the hoverboard that they had in Back to the Future, that hover skateboard, right? We don't see that in the world. It's not a possibility. Someone can think about that. What are the conditions that we would need to satisfy to bring about the hoverboard from Back to the Future, right? The sort of the hover skateboard, which would be super awesome. If in my lifetime that thing came about, I would be happy. It would be a completely meaningless gift, but it would be super cool, and I would be very happy to see that. Alright, and it would probably make a crap ton of money. Anyway, so what we do is we, as theorists, conceptualize, right, the conditions. Right? We conceptualize the conditions. There's obviously going to be obstructions here. Oh, you can't do it because of that. You can't do the hoverboard based on sort of air pressure because the mechanisms that you would need to apply to the board to get enough lift off the ground would be too big and make the board impractical. Blah, 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 blah. You can't do gravitational reverse polarity, blah, 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 because that'll shoot you into the outer space or something. Who knows? I don't know. Right? But you start to think about how would this thing be possible? What are the conditions that would allow this thing to be possible? And you try to bring it about. In terms of social science research, and just for graduate students, right, or even undergrads, because this lecture series can go either way, grad or undergrad. Undergrad, a little advanced. Grad, maybe not as advanced. So I think it's sort of balanced. It's difficult, but it's not too difficult. What the hell was I about to say? I totally lost my flippage. Oh yeah, as students, graduate or undergrad, what you recognize is the condition for the possibility of you turning in your paper, right? The condition for the possibility of me coming, I'm sort of being a little tongue-in-cheek here, but the condition for the possibility of me, in a real sense, recognizing, I hate the fact that people say social scientists create theory. We, like hard scientists, we have to discover theory. You can't just pull it out of nowhere, right? So we do, I believe, and people can argue with me, but I believe social scientists, if you're doing your social science research well, you look into the observable world for facts, you look for data, you look for statistics, you synthesize that information, and you try to find, we know that correlation is no demonstration of proof, but we try to find correlations between the occurrences of, various phenomena and give a holistic account of why these things occur, right? The idea is the social scientists can use this as well, right? I don't quite recognize why it is the case that this phenomena in our world typically corresponds with this other phenomena. And I've looked and I've searched and I haven't found any theoretical explanation of why these things occur in unison, in simultaneity, what have you. Okay, I don't see it. what would be the conditions that would have to be satisfied in order to account for the simultaneous occurrence of X and Y? Well, this might happen and this might happen. Let me see it. Let me go back into the world. So you conceptualize in your mind. Remember, we don't, and I'm going to talk about this in a second, I'll talk about this later, right? We don't just project our thoughts, our theory onto the world, right? What we do is we think that this might be right. We go into the world and we look for facts. Has that happened? When this phenomena occurs, X, and this phenomena occurs, Y, what that relationship manifests as, right, the way in which this relationship unfolds, does my theory explain that now? Yes, it does. Oh, well, wow, that's great. I've now found my representative case. I've now found my representative theoretical position. Right? I did this specifically myself in terms of my book on, which is going to be out in a little bit, on genocidal intent. There was a little bit of discourse on genocidal intent, nothing really, nothing sort of academically, either the length that I'm doing it, and this is not to discredit other theories, I'm not trying to say that, right? But not as dense and analytically rigorous as my book, right? My book is the first of its kind, period. I didn't concoct genocidal intentionality, I didn't create this. I discovered it in the world, right? I discovered it by going through years and years of research, reading on cases of genocide, reading on how people were killed, reading on the effective uses that different regimes use, you know, doing real statistical analysis to see this regime use this and they kill this many people, this regime used this and then tried to find a pattern in the world. I found it and then I wrote a book on it, right? So that's the idea. That's exactly the same thing, right? This book, whether if it's received or not well, I don't really care about that. I'm not writing this, and I'm not doing any of this for any recognition of any sort. It's to challenge myself. That's purely why I'm doing it, right? It's to challenge myself to try and find those truths, in quotes, always in quotes, to try and find those truths in the world and use my mind, in my mind alone, to locate it, right? It's through my mind, it's through your mind that we access the world. So use that mind to try and get to reality and make some sense of it, and then you flavor it however you want to flavor it, right? So being the first, genocidal intent is going to be defined as I say it's going to be defined. And people can agree or disagree, but this is how it's going to unfold, right? And we'll see what that ends up becoming. Okay, explanation. And I am going to have to segment this a bit because I'll stop at the explanation and I'll do the implication of this later. So explanation. There are two critical, important things at stake in making epistemological assessments of knowledge. There's two things that you have to factor into account. Either of self, either for your own epistemological understanding, or more complexly of group, right? There's a group dynamic to epistemology. In terms of epistemic modal, there's a part of epistemic modal that's really complex that I wouldn't put on YouTube. But there's a part of epistemic modal that doesn't apply just to my knowledge, right? My knowledge of an individual. And I've done a lot of maybe a few hours of epistemic modal on my channel, which culminated in a very, very sort of complex testimonial, logical, sort of mathematical formulation. But that was still, as complex as it still is just of one individual agent's knowledge, not of the group knowledge, right? We believe is different from I believe. We know is different from I know, and then obviously the epistemic modal logic that defines and legitimizes those claims we believe to be true. We believe these, we hold these, oh my goodness, I don't know, we hold these principles to be self-evident or what have you, I forget that, I think that's the wording. But that wording requires a whole, not different, it's the same type of epistemic, right, epistemology, epistemic modal, but it requires a whole more complex bit, right? Here are the two things that you need. First, demonstration of the possibility of X, which I've talked about. Demonstration that this is not contradictory. Aliens are possible, right? Biological organisms living on another planet are identified as aliens, I guess. I don't know that that's the particular sort of carbon-based biological organisms on another planet, right? Sure, that's what an alien is. So we talk about the possibility, that is how X is actualized, realized, manifest, functional. It can be anything depending on what your discipline is. And then the second thing that we have to do is that the theorist must also demonstrate why obstruction to the existence of X fail. Right? People who say no, it is categorically impossible, right? The obstruction would try to reinforce the impossibility of the existence of X. That's important, right? It's important to recognize that if I'm attempting to demonstrate the possibility of X, and it obviously doesn't exist or yet, right? And someone throws an obstruction to my proposed demonstration, then at least it's not exhaustive. We're not saying that it has to be the case, but it is likely the case that the individual is, in some sense, saying that the existence of what you're attempting to articulate is in fact impossible. What people don't recognize is that, and this is the point, right? And I don't want to go off into religion and jump off in the deep end, but the idea is a lot of the things that people think are impossible are actually not impossible at all. I'm talking about mathematically, logically impossible. Circle, square, simultaneous. And I think even mathematicians were playing with that at some point, the possibility of that. I'm talking about, A and not A, right? When people talk about impossibility, they say, oh, it's impossible that there could be an all-powerful, all-knowing force in the universe. Well, is that impossible? Is that really an impossibility? Or is it improbable? Right? And in another video, I'll talk about the distinctions of sort of possibility, probability, impossibility, contradiction. There's a whole hierarchy of that. And there's just a profound amount of confusion from theists and atheists alike. Most of them just, they assume things to be impossible when in fact they're improbable, right? Not impossible. There's a distinction. There's a huge distinction. So that the idea is, what the epistemologist has to do is two things. First, you have to demonstrate the possibility of X, and then after you demonstrate, and not really after, in demonstrating the possibility of X, you demonstrate how it comes to be, what the conditions for the possibility of X are, and you have to sort of thwart off any objections that would deny the existence. Once it manifests now, once it's there, if the type of research that you do brings about physical stuff in the world, right? An app that can, I don't know, do X, I don't know, a super app. The super app does X. And, oh no, that could never happen. You could never have an app that does all of that. Let's say you're more sort of mechanically inclined theorist or researcher, and you think about the conditions for the possibility that would allow the app to do that. You bring it into existence, there it is. For the social scientists, what we do is we look into the world and try and explain very, very, almost invisible, extremely difficult, extremely complex systems of relationships and identify the nature of the relationships. Oh, this is connected to that, and this is connected to that, and this is connected to that, and that's what this whole thing is. That's a lot more difficult. I'm not knocking what hard scientists do. It's not a knock, right? But in a sense, it's really, really, really difficult to try and isolate and identify relationships than it is to bring about the existence of a thing. Right? Both are important. We need both. Our reality is comprised of both relationships and things. Hard scientists really look at sort of stuff, right? Even if it's invisible quantum stuff, right? They look at stuff. Social, and I use stuff in scare quotes, right? Because they might argue that. Social scientists, for the most part, look at relationships. And I don't mean that in an interpersonal in a personal setting, though I'm not excluding that, right? It's relationships between phenomena, and we try to make sense of our reality, and really what we try to do is predict so that we can control. But we try to make sense of these relationships, and the way that we do that is through theoretical contemplation and epistemological rigor. So I'm going to stop here because I'm an hour in to this section and I have half a page to go. I'm not going to be able to make it. So I'm going to stop here and then I'll return in the next section, in the next installment, and continue the analysis. With that, I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell. Have a good day.